All right, welcome. So today we are talking about inclusive design, accommodations, and flexible assessment. And some of this is a little bit of an extension of what we started 2 weeks ago with accommodations, particularly for students on the autism spectrum and students with learning disabilities. But we're really going to be looking at how inclusive design, accommodations, and flexible assessments can support all students. I think everybody here knows me, but my name is Laura Sarchet. I'm the Inclusive Higher Education Graduate Assistant at the U of R. I'm a Warner student and I'm an autistic self-advocate. So I am so glad you're here today. So as always, I want to start with a little bit of context to just remind us who might be in your classes or who you might be interacting with on campus here at the University of Rochester, students with and without disabilities. So you may have tour students who are BOCES students in the transition opportunities at the U of R program. Tour students have the opportunity to register for classes as an audit, and they also participate with their peers on campus. Tour students are students with intellectual and developmental disabilities in a BOCES classroom here in Melior Hall. You may have students who are registered with the Office of Disability Resources. As a student with a disability, they may receive accommodations through that office. You may also have neurodiverse students or students with brain-based disabilities who are not registered with the Office of Disability Resources or who identify as being neurodiverse and who may not need formal accommodations, but still really benefit from a lot of these supports. And your neurotypical students or your students without disabilities benefit from a lot of these supports. So just a reminder of who might be in your classes and interacting with you across campus that are going to be supported by all the things that you are learning in this series. So our agenda for today is we'll go over our learning objectives. As always, we'll review supports and accommodations, which we started last time 2 weeks ago. And we'll talk about those. We'll talk about flexible assessments. We will dive into something called the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD, and how to appropriately challenge, scaffold, and prompt students who need more support. We'll talk about universal design for learning, or UDL, and then we'll spend some time talking about how to support students' executive functioning skills. And as always, we'll have action steps and time for questions and answers at the end. So the objective today is that you will develop your capacity to provide accommodations and use inclusively designed supports, and identify one action step to take your own practice even further towards being an even more inclusive educator. So I want to start with providing a brief overview of universal design for learning, sometimes called UDL. And universal design for learning is comes out of universal design, which is where we are designing spaces with people with disabilities in mind, but then it benefits all individuals. So for example, you may have a curb cut or a ramp that is necessary for someone who is a wheelchair user to access the space, but it's also beneficial for people who are using a bicycle, for people who have a stroller, for people who are carrying luggage, all kinds of things like that. So universal design for learning incorporates 3 different areas. The why of learning is the engagement portion of universal design for learning. And this is how students are motivated or how learners are motivated and interested in what they're doing, how they're engaged. The what of learning is kind of what we maybe think of most often as our content. This is how we represent information, presenting it in different ways. And then finally, the how of learning is action or expression. This is sometimes what we call assessment. This is how students are demonstrating what they have learned. So the student action and expression. So I just want to give us a brief overview of that before we talk about supports and accommodations, and then we'll come back to doing universal design for learning in a little bit more depth. But while we're talking about supports, I want you to think about these 3 areas: the engagement, the representation, and the action and expression, to see how kind of they overlap. And then we're also providing supports in all 3 of those areas. So I'm Not going to go in depth on supports. If you want to hear about those, we did record that portion of the session 2 weeks ago. So that's on the YouTube channel if you want to hear more about general supports that are helpful for all students, and especially for students with disabilities and neurodiverse students. And today I want to spend more time talking about accommodations. So accommodations are similar to supports in that they are beneficial to students who need something a little bit different. Accommodations are often thought of as more formal, and they may be provided through the Office of Disability Resources. But some of these accommodations are also things that you can incorporate in your practices as supports. So if I'm a student with a disability who's registered for the Office of Disability Resources, and I come into a classroom space and the professor already has copies of notes available and extended time on assignments available, and maybe some technology that's really flexible and user-friendly for me, I may not need to apply for accommodations for that particular class. Similarly, if I come into your office space, if you're a staff member and I come in and there's some visual representation, some some flexibility in like whether or not I meet you over Zoom or in person, those kinds of things, I may not need to request accommodations as a student employee, or just as a student being able to access your office in a more accessible way. So these are things, I list them as accommodations, but know that a lot of these things may not be something you're doing specifically for one student who needs an accommodation, but you can also provide them as supports for all students, depending on your space, to try to make it more accessible. So, but again, these are common accommodations that students may have, especially for testing. Extended time on exams usually is time and a half for students who receive an accommodation. So whatever time you give the class, you would, if this was a formal accommodation, provide an extra 50% of that time. So if it was a 2-hour exam, you provide 3 hours for that student. That goes for Blackboard, that goes for in person, that goes for online. A way that this can be helpful in general as a support is if your exams are maybe untimed or take home. And that means that this accommodation is kind of null and void. So this kind of comes back to what we talked about a couple weeks ago with like moving from accommodations to liberation and justice and accessibility, that if we're in a space that's completely accessible, individuals don't need accommodations in order to access that space because we're already providing those things. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to flexible assessments as well. The delivery mode of exams can be flexible. So some students may be, we might arrange with the Office of Disability Resources for students to do an oral exam instead of doing a written exam. That can be something that a lot of times faculty will bring in multiple modes of assessments into their classes as options already. So sometimes instead of writing a paper, students are allowed to give a PowerPoint or give a voice presentation for that kind of like final project for the class, or for smaller projects throughout. So students may need or use audio recordings in class. So recording lectures is something, I've encouraged a lot of you to do. I've encouraged you to do in general so that students can access it back. But this is something that if you're not recording your lectures or recording your meetings regularly, that can be really helpful, and students might request that as an accommodation. Again, we can work out that with our office. We also have some smart pens in our office, in the Office of Disability Resources, that allow students to take notes, and it records in time with the audio recording of the lecture while the student is taking notes. So then when they go back to their notes in that particular place, they can hear what was happening in the classroom at that time as well. Some students may use a copy of notes. So this can be a couple different ways. You can provide these through the instructor can provide an outline of notes, or a copy of the filled in notes, or a copy of the class outline, or you can crowdsource notes and have students share their notes with each other, either in a shared Google document or like scanning and making copies after class. I love it when faculty have some kind of digital space that's shared and all students can collaborate in on that, like a shared Google document. That's really helpful. And again, that's an example of a student who normally needs a copy of notes as an accommodation wouldn't necessarily need that in that space because there's already this kind of incorporated as a support. Students may need to use audiobooks, so having access to that audio instead of having to read text. This is also really helpful if you can provide materials in digital formats, because then the screen readers will be able to read a PDF or a Word document or a scanned chapter, whereas that is a lot harder to do when you have a hard copy of something. So that's really helpful for a lot of students. Some students may use text-to-speech technology. So this is sometimes also called, excuse me, this is what I was just talking about with the audiobooks. There's also screen readers that you can use. There's extensions on Google Chrome that are really helpful that you can just attach to your Google browser and then have it, highlight text and read aloud what's on your screen. So that, can promote comprehension for students and can also promote access for students with low vision. Or maybe if they have a learning disability or reading difficulties, that's also really helpful. Other examples of technology that students might use, you may use a speech to text or a dictation software as well. So Office 365 actually has this feature, and you can actually record what you're saying, and then it'll write down, kind of similar to how our Zoom calls do the captioning. There's a speech to text feature, so you can open a Word document and then click dictate, and it will show you, you just start talking and it records what you're saying on the page through the machine typing it. So I often encourage students to use that as like a way to really get started with writing. Sometimes that's really hard to, oh, I have this final paper, like how do I even start? Well, maybe just start talking about your project and see what the computer, can do for you while you're talking. And then you can go back and edit it and work on the written portion that way. Extended time on assignments and flexible attendance. We've talked about this. We talked about this quite a bit last week if you came to the Warner Talk, where it's often very helpful if you are flexible in your policies on late work, making sure that you're focusing on what the learning objective is, and if students are still meeting the learning objective, trying to give them credit for those things, and allowing them to turn in late work if possible in the semester. This doesn't mean that we're, kind of getting rid of due dates altogether. It's still very helpful to have that structure and to have things scaffolded so students know, it's not just everything goes and everything's due at the end of the semester, but you still have due dates to try to keep students on track. But knowing that our students, all of our students, especially during COVID, but all of our students with disabilities, our students with mental illnesses or chronic illnesses, may have things come up, and it's important that we're still giving them time to access our learning in the courses that we're teaching, and provide that flexibility while they're still kind of managing all of those other pieces too. And then you can also work with somebody from our office or someone, like the student, if there's issues with behavior in your class, you can work on a behavior plan for very often individualized students. This is not super common at the college level, but if there's, a particular need in one of your classes, I think we talked about this the first week, like with students maybe calling out or, using technology in class when that's not something that you're expecting. Those are often conversations that we need to involve the student in those conversations about those expectations, really see what they need to successfully access the space, and then also making sure that you can come up with a plan together between the faculty or staff person and the student to kind of find common ground and common expectations. So that is something that, again, if you're not comfortable doing by yourself with the student, feel free to reach out to our Office of Disability Resources. And myself or one of our access coordinators are happy to meet with you and kind of arrange those things. I also linked a document here, which takes you to a PDF of accommodations for cognitive and academic needs. So that has lots more accommodations and supports that can be really helpful. I also just realized I forgot to share the slides if you didn't get the email from me earlier. So there are the slides for you, so you can access those at any time. Questions about accommodations before we talk about flexible assessment? Okay. So I started talking about flexible assessment with just reminding us why we even do assessment. So if you've been to some of my trainings before, you probably know what I'm going to say, but the purpose of assessment is that we are trying to assess the learning objectives and the learning goals, bless you, of the class for the student, and whether the student is meeting the learning objectives. So if we're teaching a history course and we want students to memorize content, that would be the objective of that assessment. If we want students to make connections and critically think about how history affects our world today, then we might not be so worried about them remembering the exact dates of historical events. And we're more looking at assessing their connections and their synthesis and critical analysis of that information. So, and in both of those situations, we're not stating that it's a writing goal or a reading goal that we're trying to assess. We're not trying to assess something that is not defined as a clear goal in that space by the learning objectives. If you do want to assess those things like reading or writing or speaking skills or presentation skills, then we need to clearly define our objectives with students beforehand so they know that that is part of the assessment. But I find that those are often things that we end up assessing when really that's not what the learning goal was. If the learning goal was something else, we want to make sure that that's what we're focusing on. So we're always looking at our learning targets. And then all of the other pieces that kind of go into how the student gets to the learning target or how they express their knowledge of and understanding of the learning target and standards, that sometimes can be barriers to their actual expression and action. So that's why we provide flexible assessments so that we can try to remove some of those barriers. So there are lots of different types of assessments, and this is not an exhaustive list at all, but there are, you can do a paper, like a final paper, formal or informal. Reflection papers are more informal, but that's also a type of assessment. Our traditional tests, exams, or quizzes, all different kinds of projects, PowerPoints, presentations, some maybe a little bit different ones that we don't think of as traditional assessments, but can still assess our learning objectives, are having a roundtable discussion or a roundtable presentation. So having students prepare what they've learned about a topic to come in and just, do a 5-minute kind of coffee talk type situation and then be able to answer questions from their peers or from the professor. So, that is a way we can assess students' learning too. Again, a discussion. So that can be instructor-led, that can be student-led, that can be, the questions ahead of time, you don't know the questions ahead of time. All of those are ways that we can assess students' understanding as well. Making posters and then also making video and or audio products can also be a way of assessing students' understanding. So I think about the ways that we are using all of these different assessments. And I just want to make sure that we're thinking about some of the potential barriers that some of these may have. So I'll give an example from the Warner School because that's where I am. So often we will write papers as our assignments or assessments in the Warner School. And Sometimes faculty or instructors assess, they maybe have a specific learning objective about synthesis of the course material, connections to our own practice. There could be a variety of things that they're actually trying to assess with that paper. Sometimes APA style or the actual writing mechanics are part of that assessment. Sometimes they are not. So if they're not one of the core standards that we're trying to assess, we need to not let that get in the way of assessing the actual content and understanding that the student is demonstrating in that paper. So it's fine to define it as one of the standards if you are concerned about writing mechanics and you do want to have that count towards the assessment and you want to look for whether the students have mastery of writing mechanics. That's fine, but we have to define that ahead of time so students know. And if we choose not to do that, then we have to really be intentional about focusing on the content. Similarly with tests, exams, and quizzes, sometimes that memorization piece can be a real barrier for students. And we think about, our goal in college is kind of sometimes classified as like trying to prepare students for the quote unquote real world, right? And, that's really important. But we can also think about like what students are doing right now, and what we're doing right now is the real world. And then often when students leave the college space and go to another space, whether they're going to employment or another post-secondary setting, I think about in my job, I don't have timed closed book assessments anymore. Right? When I prepare a presentation, I'm allowed to use all of the resources that I want to. I can look stuff up on Google. I can look back at the notes that I took at that one conference that I thought was so awesome. I can look back at the previous presentations I've given on this topic. And, I don't have to sit down and do it in an hour and 30 minutes. I can space it out. I can do it all at once if I want. I can do it a week ahead and then come back and look at it later. And that's really very much the case for a lot of the workspaces that we are in. So I just throw that out there to kind of think about how we can incorporate that for our students. And maybe if we still want to give a test or an exam or a quiz, maybe think about whether or not are you actually trying to assess the student's memorization or quick thinking, or are we trying to assess their understanding of content in a different way? And if so, maybe think about making that a take-home test, maybe think about making it another type of assessment, maybe think about making it open book or untimed, maybe even a group test where students can work together. So just a couple of thoughts about those things. So I absolutely love rubrics for assessments. I think they are super helpful, and I think they provide a way for us to kind of combat some of those barriers by making sure that we're setting our expectations up front. So rubrics are really helpful. And in grading criteria, I highly recommend using rubrics for every assessment or assignment that you can, if possible. So even if, it's a basic discussion post, maybe have a 1 point be about the length of the assignment and whether the student met the required length. 1 point could be about writing mechanics. 1 point could be about respect for peers in the online discussion space, if that's what you're doing. And then maybe the other 3 or 4 points can be, actual synthesis of the content and what you're trying to assess. So whenever you're using a rubric, you want to be specific and have criteria for each. I often recommend doing different levels of expectation. So below expectation, approaching or meeting expectations, and exceeding or above expectations. And that will kind of show the credit that a student gets for each of those areas. You want to list and describe all parts of the assignment. And often providing a model is very helpful for students, whether it's a paper or a presentation or a video recording. If you can create a model of the assessment or show an example from a previous year in the course, that's really, really helpful. for students. And then checklists are also helpful to make sure that students have all the parts of the assignment there. We want to make sure that the rubric is related to our learning objectives. And making it visual is really helpful too. So we can provide, like we've talked about in previous weeks, visual supports along with the assessment. So maybe an icon representing each of the portions of the assignment that needs to be done. Again, that ties into models. And finally, the last thing I want to say about rubrics is I would encourage you to, well, definitely provide rubrics ahead of time for students so that they know how they're going to be assessed. You know, that's kind of partly why rubrics work, right? Because we're setting students up for success. We want them to get full points on the rubric because they know what to expect and they know how to do it, because we've given them parameters for what they should do. But I also encourage your students to do self-assessment on the rubric. So this can be formal or informal. So informally, you could have students just, you know, as part of the assignment, take the rubric home, make sure that they're looking at the rubric and checking to make sure their assignment aligns with all of the rubrics. And then you'll often find students will say, oh, I forgot to do this section of the rubric. I better add that to my assignment. So you can do that. You can also do this more formally and have students turn in a filled out copy of the rubric based on how they think they did on an assignment. This is something that is helpful to provide scaffolding and support for, especially with with our undergrads. I think some of our graduate students are maybe a little more familiar with doing self-assessment in rubrics, but they can also use the support too. So maybe demonstrating how you would do a self-assessment in class with a rubric on a particular assignment, and thinking about, modeling how you would assess yourself on a particular assessment. So that can be something that you do peer assessments too, or group assessments, so that students can work together to try to identify what they've gotten so far on the rubric, and maybe if there's areas that they want to improve. And then I've also seen faculty do have students do self-assessment and then incorporate that into the grade for the assessment. So if a student believes that they have done well, and they can justify that, then the faculty would also look at the rubric and assess them that way, and then maybe kind of put together looking at both the faculty rubric and the student rubric to kind of maybe have a conversation or maybe take into consideration. I've also seen this done with evaluations for like staff self-assessment and performance. So having a staff person or a student worker fill out a self-assessment, and then having their supervisor also fill out an assessment on a rubric, and then kind of compare and have a conversation about it. And when we do this in the Center for Community Engagement, I've had student workers who've come up with really great justifications, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot that you did that. You're right. We should give you a higher score on this part of the rubric because you reminded me of something that I forgot about. And that's really helpful. So, so I think this can really apply to not just the classroom, but to our students as student employees, and other ways like that too. So I also want to talk about zone of proximal development, scaffolding, and prompting supports. So the zone of proximal development is kind of this in-between area. It's between what a student or a learner can do independently or by themselves or without any support, and what they cannot do even with support. So in this diagram, it is the yellow area between the green and the white that represents what the learner can do with support, what needs to be done to take the learner from what they can already do into what they can't do. So this moves a lot. So what I can do with help today, I may be able to do independently tomorrow. And then something else that I couldn't do yesterday, maybe today I can do that with help. And that happens with scaffolding. So here's another way of representing the zone of proximal development. And it shows that as learning and development move, a student is going from what they can do independently into their zone of proximal development, and then what the student couldn't do or was beyond their reach would become, with scaffolding, something that they can do. So if you're doing tasks that are in the zone of proximal development with students, this is where the most learning occurs. So we want to try to think about what our students can do that's not too easy or too difficult for them. And again, this doesn't apply just to the classroom, but also to ways we're engaging with students in our offices, to ways that we're engaging our student employees. So if a student is in kind of this area of current knowledge and skills, it's okay to be there, right? It's okay to have tasks that we can already do and feel really confident with. But if we're there too long, we become kind of comfortable, maybe a little bored, maybe it feels a little too safe. On the other hand, if we're in this area of beyond reach challenge, again, that may be kind of interesting and exciting for a very short period of time. But if we're spending much time there, it gets very stressful. Students become anxious, disinclined to learning, frustrated, exhausted, maybe even fearful of school because they're not provided the right support. So if a student, if a student is in this in-between area where they are challenged just enough, or they are provided the scaffolds or supports that they couldn't do it by themselves, but with support they could do it, then they're going to be in their zone of proximal development. And this is where they're most excited and active in their learning, most engaged. So thinking about that universal design for learning engagement piece of the why we're doing something. And this is really important for students to be willing to take risks. So, I think about even in my job, I have a lot of tasks that, I can do that are maybe in this orange zone, right? And so, and I like doing those, right? And they're comfortable. And so, maybe things like filling out spreadsheets or, filling in data for something, and like, that's awesome. That's great. But then I also have pieces of my job that are a little bit challenging and a little bit requiring me to take some risks. So for example, doing some of these workshops is, it's definitely something I do a lot, but it's not something, it's not boring. It's not safe. It's not stable. It's very exciting. It's active. It's a little bit challenging, just enough so that it makes me excited about it. And it makes me engaged in the process of what's happening. So, and then there's some things that I really do need a lot of support with that I would ask for help with on my job. So maybe preparing for a meeting with someone that I haven't met before, I might have to ask for some support. So, but again, if most of our activities are kind of, or at least some of our activities are in this zone of proximal development, that's going to make our experience a lot more active and engaging. So similarly in the classroom, we can provide for students activities that they can do with support that are a little bit challenging for them, maybe even a lot challenging, but they have the supports that they can still be successful. And that's going to help students be most engaged in the classroom activities. So scaffolding is something that we can do to support students to make tasks more appropriate for whatever level they are at. So if students can't do something independently, we can scaffold to make that a supported activity. So maybe providing a graphic organizer for a writing task. That's a scaffold that then they can use to practice and do something with a little bit of guidance on the graphic organizer, and then transfer it into an outline and then into their own writing. Another example of scaffolding is the I do, we do, you do method. So this is from Madeline Hunter, who's an educator, and she talks about this method of first you model and think aloud as the instructor. So if I was doing a math lesson, I would write the problem on the board and I would talk through every single step of the way. I would say, I'm thinking about this number, now I'm doing addition, so I'm going to think about adding and making the number bigger. And for like an elementary school math lesson, for example. So I'm going to talk through the whole problem, do the whole thing as the instructor. Then we would do guided practice, which is we do. So the students could work together, or the students and the instructor can work together. And I can kind of break this down into a couple of different scaffolding levels. So first, I might say, okay, I'm going to do the problem again, but you're going to tell me each step. So I call on someone from the class to tell me what to write next as I go through each step of the math problem. Then you can have a student lead and have them call on students, and still the students are working together, but there's still guided practice for this. And the teacher is still there to kind of make sure that students are on track. And if there's misconceptions, we can address them. You can also have students work together in groups so they can kind of catch each other. And then independent practice is the you do, where students work on their own. So this could be independent work time during class. It could also be what you send home for homework. But I want to stress that this independent practice should be the same skill that was worked on in the previous steps. So for example, if I'm doing, just to keep with the math example, if I'm doing single step or single digit addition in the instruction and the guided practice, and then I send home students homework with 3-digit addition, that's not going to be accessible to them. So we want to make sure that we're kind of providing the instruction, guided practice, and independent practice at each level, so they can build on that, but with the support that's needed. So you'd want to send home the homework with single-digit addition as well, because that's what you worked on with the I do and we do sections as well. So we don't want to send students away to do something independently that's like 3 steps beyond what we showed them how to do. And again, that goes with, in our offices, not just in the classroom too, and with tasks that we're helping students with. I think, sometimes, thinking about registration coming up, right? So sometimes all of those forms and even using You Are Student and all the online platforms, that can be a lot for students. And, so if that's something a student is working through and maybe you're supporting them, those kinds of things can also be applied with the I do, we do, you do practice. And then students can take home, what they've already done a couple times through the modeling and guided practice with you, then they can do the rest on their own if it's the same parts of the task. Explicit instruction is also really important. And I think, especially for students with disabilities, but I think it is best practice for much of the teaching we do, is to provide very explicit instructions and making sure we're clear in what we're teaching as content. There are places for inquiry and for students to kind of explore on their own, but we want to make sure that those are structured enough that we can address misconceptions as they come up. And there, is research that shows that kind of inquiry-based instruction is actually better for like very high achieving learners and very self-directed learners, and sometimes not even for students at the college level, but post-college is more appropriate for that. So explicit instruction is often more accessible for our students, when they're knowing exactly what they're supposed to be learning. Chunking or breaking things down into steps can be based on content. So kind of like with the math example, we're breaking each of the problems down into steps, but we can also break tasks down into steps. And then finally, we want to support the least, we want to provide the least support needed for scaffolding, so as to not infringe on a student's independence. And we want to promote them to be independent and autonomous. So if a student doesn't need support in an area, maybe they don't need something broken down into steps, encourage them to break it down into steps on their own, or jump right in and see what they can do if you think that that's appropriate for the student. And students will often tell you if you're providing too much support. They'll say, you know what, I can do it on my own. And that's a great way for them to advocate for themselves. So We want to think about that. So we're always kind of working our students towards more independence. And that brings me to prompting. So prompting is a way of providing support for a student with any kind of task or any kind of assignment or activity. So I'm going to use the example of when you pass out papers to a class as the instructor, the expectation is that the students write their name at the top of the paper, and then we go on with the instruction and start the task, right? So the task that the student is needing to do at that time is to know that they're supposed to write their name at the top of the paper and to actually complete that task. So if a student is completely independent with that and no guidance is needed, what that looks like is I pass out the papers to the class, and student A goes ahead and writes their name on their paper, and we start the lesson right away. If a student doesn't do that automatically, they might need a little more of what's called an intrusive prompt. So this hierarchy goes from least intrusive or least amount of support to the most intrusive or most amount of support. So an expectant pause would be passing out the papers and then standing at the front of the room and waiting with an expectant pause. And then maybe that will prompt that student to write their name at the top of the paper, because, oh, I need to do something right now. I need to write my name at the top of the paper. Indirect verbal goes a little bit more supportive and says, okay, I passed out papers. What do you need to do next? And so it doesn't say what should be done, but indicates that something does need to be done. Partial verbal is a little bit more supportive than that and says that, what do you need to write at the top of your paper? So it gives part of the explicit directions with the understanding that the student has enough of independence to be able to remember the rest of the directions when we only provide them partial verbal support. And all of these would be, after a skill has been taught. So this is with the expectation that it's not new information that we're writing our name at the top of the paper when the instructor passes out papers. A direct verbal would be simply just saying, please write your name at the top of the paper. Gestural would be walking over and pointing to the top of the paper. Modeling would be taking your hand or a pen and writing something so that the student knows to write their name, or maybe even writing the student's name at the top of the paper. A partial physical guidance would maybe be to tap the student's elbow or the shoulder so that they can start to write their name at the top of the paper. And then full physical guidance would be a hand over hand. So like actually, kind of taking the student's hand and like helping them write their name at the top of the paper. So again, you can see that these are various levels of support, and you can see maybe you have a lot of students who might need some of these, like an expectant pause or a partial verbal, some of these. And then maybe you can think of students in the past that you may have required some more supportive prompting, especially in different settings. But I want to talk about, some reasons that sometimes students become dependent on prompts. And we want to try to work so that students can be independent, right? So reliance on a single instructor can be one reason. So if students, seem to be needing more support or than you think that they should be because of where they're at, it might be because they are relying on a single instructor. So I see this more often in the K-12 world, where there's like co-teachers or maybe like a paraprofessional and a teacher, but this can also be in the college setting when there's like a TA and an instructor. So maybe this is a clue that maybe the instructor and the TA both have to give directions kind of on and off and take turns doing that, rather than always this, for example, the TA always prompting a student to do something. Overuse of prompts can also lead to dependency on prompts. Helping too much or too soon, failure to evade prompts. So when a student is successful with a more intrusive prompt, next time we want to try to be a little less intrusive with the prompt. So if a student, does write their name at the top of the paper when we say, what do you need to do at the top of your paper? Then maybe next time when you hand out the papers, say, okay, what do you need to do now? And give an indirect verbal. So kind of moving down the prompt hierarchy as the student gains more skills is called prompt fading. Finally, repeated use of the prompt hierarchy across all environments. This means that students will be able to be more successful with the same activity in different environments, and that's totally natural. So, in a smaller class setting, a student may be completely independent with a task, but then when they're in a large group setting, and this could be a task such as speaking up in a class discussion. Maybe they do that really comfortably and independently when it's a small group, but then in their large class, they're really uncomfortable with that. And maybe you do need to provide them some verbal prompting or even gestural prompting to kind of encourage them to be part of that class discussion. And that's totally fine. What we don't want to do is provide them with more prompts in the small group than they need, because that's saying, you know what, you don't need to be independent in this group. I'm going to prompt you. But we want to really help our students be independent and support them, especially when they demonstrate that independence. So just thinking about that, this can be different across different settings. And, I'm sure there are some tasks that you do better in one setting than another setting, and that's really the same for our students too. We've talked about universal design for learning. So the representation is how we present information. So we can present information through writing, through visual supports, through verbal information, and through hands-on information as well. So this could be when you're giving a lecture, a content lecture, or maybe even writing your agenda on the board and then also talking through it and providing a visual agenda. Maybe handing out an agenda. Same thing with a content lesson. We can provide a written handout, use a PowerPoint, and talk through the lesson and talk through the content. So that's what kind of we're doing as we present information. The expression is the assessment or how students are demonstrating. So this is, again, those formal and informal assessments that we talked about are ways that students can express what they've learned. And then finally, the engagement piece, which was the first thing we talked about when we talked about UDL at the beginning of this training session. This is, we want to have a clear purpose. So students are going to be more engaged and they're going to say, okay, I know why I'm learning. When we define our objectives, when we say, even stating at the beginning of a meeting, we're here today to talk about XYZ. It can be really, really helpful in setting the tone and making something more engaging. Maybe even asking students, like, what do you think the purpose of this meeting today is? Or what would you like to be the outcome of this meeting? Or, what is your goal for learning today? Collaboration can also be a motivating factor. So having students work together. And then reflection is also helpful. So to having students think about what they've learned, self-reflection and assessment can be helpful, but also just reflecting on the cognitive practices that they're doing through metacognition and thinking about their own learning, thinking about thinking. So the last topic we're going to talk about today, and then we'll have hopefully some time for questions at the end, is executive functioning. So executive functioning is a set of skills that involve our working memory, our cognitive flexibility, and our inhibitory control. So these are, we all have executive functioning skills, and we may have a range of executive functioning skills. Many times students with disabilities, especially developmental and intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, all of those things do affect executive functioning. So you may see some executive function needs with your students. So we're going to talk about what those needs look like and how to support them. So here are examples of executive functioning skills and how this is manifested in kind of the college or classroom setting. So self-monitoring, if someone has difficulty with self-monitoring, they may be unaware of how their actions are perceived. So this could be, this could look like social skills, this could look like, behavior in the classroom perhaps, or even just like a lack of planning ahead and understanding the consequences of whatever action. So if I don't study tonight, I might not have the executive functioning to self-monitor and think, oh, that's gonna, influence tomorrow that I'm gonna have a late homework assignment that's not gonna get turned in. Organization is trouble with planning and prioritizing tasks, difficulty with time management, maybe easily losing or forgetting needed items. Working memory is trouble with remembering. And individuals who have difficulty with working memory work best with single step instructions. So you may give a multi-step instruction like take your paper, go over to your group, start the lab, and then record your findings. That's a lot of directions. So doing each of those one at a time would support someone with executive functioning needs. You can also break that down with agendas and steps and checklists and things like that. So, if you give a multi-step direction and someone just kind of freezes and, maybe you think they're ignoring you, maybe think again, they might be having some trouble with their working memory and not know where to start. They may kind of have just, heard the directions and freeze because they don't know where to start. Executive functioning also affects our flexible thinking. So individuals can be rigid, might have difficulty seeing other angles or solutions of a problem. Emotional control, this can look like easily overreacting, outbursts, anxiety, anger. Impulse control, so maybe blurting out answers, maybe eating when not hungry, or risky behaviors that can sometimes lead to injury. Task initiation is a big one that we see in the college setting, that students may be overwhelmed when starting a task, and this sometimes looks like procrastination. So students may just not know where to start. It might not be that they're like trying to procrastinate, but they might just need a little bit of guidance with how to start a task. And we'll talk about that now. So some of our ways that we can support individuals with supporting their executive functioning, we can change our language. So I have kind of 8 phrases in red, and then kind of an alternate idea in kind of this pinkish white color for how we can maybe support someone in a little bit better way. So if someone is struggling with a task and you just say, oh, this is easy, that's not going to be encouraging them to work on their executive functioning skills or work on the activity. But having someone self-reflect on a scale of 0 to 10, how easy or challenging is this for you, is already getting them engaged in that process. And then maybe you can provide supports from there. Similarly, you're late, or hurry up, or calm down, or you should have brought that with you. These are all kind of like corrective phrases. And to support executive functioning, we want to think about how we're supporting a solution, and maybe that's just a solution for next time. So if someone's late, they're not going to all of a sudden be on time for the class that they're already late for, but they might be on time next time. So we want to demonstrate that we're glad that they're there. Maybe taking a time check or taking some deep breaths. So a strategy. Here I've got this, you don't have your pen with you today. Here, I have one that you can borrow. Next time you can remember your pen, that kind of thing. Instead of telling students, I already told you, or you're on your own with a task, we could ask them, where can we find that information? Maybe point them to that information. Telling students we want them to try it on their own first. So promoting that independence, but we're here and we can support. And then finally, the last one I want to talk about is saying, oh, I'll just do it for you. Sometimes it seems a little easier for us to just, as an instructor or as a staff person, just like, oh, I'll just do it for you. It's going to be faster if I just do it. But that doesn't support students' executive functioning. So telling students that they can do it and we believe in them is very helpful. Finally, some other strategies to support executive functioning success. A lot of these we've talked about in the last couple of weeks. So visuals, written agendas, step-by-step schedules, breaking down tasks, using a folder or a binder system, helping students organize their Google Drive, for example. Maybe that's something you can do and then help them to maintain it. That's a way to support executive functioning. Using a planner with to-do lists, directions, one step at a time, using graphic organizers, I find using timers and alarms really helpful. So if we set a timer for, okay, let's work for 5 minutes and then we'll, kind of take a break from there. Or, when we, hit the 15-minute mark, we're going to transition to the next activity. Providing checklists, checking for understanding by asking students to repeat back in their own words rather than just asking yes or no, do you understand? And then model prioritization of tasks. So this is a really important one that, we as instructors and staff can do to show students that, we're practicing through Think Aloud. Oh, I have this task that's due tomorrow and I have this task that I really want to do, but it's not due until Friday. So I'm going to do this one first because that's more important to get that done earlier. So kind of doing that Think Aloud process. So as always, I'd love to leave you with just thinking about how you can reflect on inclusion, accommodations, and supports. Think about how you can make assessment more flexible. Maybe check out another resource, ask a colleague or myself or someone else from our office to kind of help you with accessibility. If you want to do like an audit of one of your courses or one of your office spaces, we're happy to help with that. And any professional development, I'm always here for that too. So, and as always, if you have other ideas, I'd love to hear them from you too. Thank you so much.